Let's pray. Lord, we pray that you would help me as I try to condense a lot of material, good things to think about, things that are interesting, help us understand Scripture and the faithfulness of the biblical account, and also, again, how to think carefully about the problems that we encounter and be responsible there. We ask that you would just glean something from the material tonight that encourages us in our study of Scripture. In your name we pray. Amen. You know, I confess, I've sort of been moping all day about this. Because when I taught a course in the history of Israel at Western, and, you know, it's Western, okay, but it's easy to not do theology when it's a history of Israel class because, you know, you don't dig up God, so you can't really get into divine causation or anything like that. But it really doesn't matter because you go through the same material. Well, it took me 2 weeks to go through Exodus stuff. That's 6 days. And so we're going to try to do it in an hour. And every time I think about that, I think, you got to be kidding. You know, like, really? You know, just bail, abandon ship, and all that sort of thing. But, you know, something will happen in the next hour. And hopefully you'll get a little glimpse as far as what we need to think about. This period, patriarchs, we're going to spend most of our time with Moses and Exodus, the Exodus event. This is sort of what everybody thinks of when they think of biblical archaeology. Because it's such a fundamental event. You know, we all have seen the Ten Commandments on TV, and there's all these TV specials that sort of zero in on Moses and the Exodus because it's fundamental to Judaism, you know, having historical credibility, and that means it's fundamental to Christianity and whatnot. So it sort of presents itself as not only an interesting topic, but for critics, it presents itself as a nice big fat bullseye. And so you get a lot of talk about this stuff. And I'm going to try to give you a sense for what the options are, why there's so much skepticism, and why there doesn't have to be so much skepticism. And hopefully, you'll take away, from this evening that just a little exposure to that, again, how the whole subject gets thought about. Now, I have here, again, a little bit from last week, that one of the problems here, several problems here, that I noted in general, we can also note for the patriarchs. I mentioned last time there was no specific evidence for the patriarchs in that you don't find the bones of Abraham or the bones of Jacob or something like that, or the bones of Joseph. You don't dig up a text, at least to this point, outside the Bible that has the biblical story or something really, really, really close to it with biblical names in it. Okay, what you do find is you find material that when you superimpose the biblical story on that material, there is considerable overlap in places, and there's gaps in other places. So the goal is to always try to look at the context, create the picture, and ask the question, is the biblical story coherent in this time period? Now we're going to talk a bit about chronology tonight. It's a huge problem. And really, again, how material remains, how archaeology can get applied or not applied, and in some cases, I'll be honest with you, people refuse to apply it. I'm bold enough to say that I think there's a little bit too much presuppositional skepticism in the academy, that when something comes along, there's actually a hesitance to make a connection to the biblical material. And, whatever the reason is, it's easy to say, well, you just don't want it to be true because that overturns your apple cart. And there's probably some of that. But there's other things that work too. A lot of these people tend to be naturally cautious. One of the big problems is there's a small data sampling. You're going to hear me talk about Jericho a little bit, and next week we'll do a little bit of Jericho. We're going to be talking about the conquest. And different sites in Egypt, the Delta, different biblical place names. The reality is that even places where archaeologists have spent a lot of time in haven't been excavated very much. The notion of excavating an entire town like Jericho, that's not the case. And Jericho is one of the most famous sites in all of the Holy Land. There's only been parts of it excavated because it's a long, painstaking process. So this is an older source, 1980, but it's still very true. In Palestine alone, of the more than 6,000 sites surveyed, fewer than 200 have been excavated, and of these, only 28 to any major extent. Some sites are still occupied. I mean, you don't just move everything out of Jerusalem to dig up old Jerusalem. You don't do that. So there's natural impediments to it. And even the precise location of some places, Jericho's pretty well known, but people still fight about quite a bit. There's a lot of uncertainty here. So one of the things that should be going off in your head is, well, maybe we shouldn't make, our conclusions shouldn't be so dogmatic if there's a substantial amount of uncertainty. And that's true. That's true. So you shouldn't ever be disturbed by something, again, that you hear on TV about archaeology, this and that. There's always two sides of a story. There's always two sides of a debate. And when you get right down to brass tacks, there's a lot more that could be said in theory if there was just more work done, if there was just more data produced. That's always the case. Now, as far as the patriarchs go, I'm only going to mention a couple things because I really want to get to, again, the Exodus material. One of the things you'll read about, and I think this is a good example of how archaeology can be both used and misused with respect to the patriarchs, were the Nuzi tablets. Now these are exactly what they sound like, a bunch of clay tablets, 4,000 of them, so it's a pretty big pile. Found in the 20s, early 30s, they date to the 15th, 14th centuries BC. Now if you're taking the biblical chronology at face value, that is the Moses era. It's not Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, it's later. But there were things in these tablets, marriage contracts, wills, land, slave purchases, that actually mirrored the patriarchal narratives in some way. And when these were initially discovered, there were, let's see if I have a picture, let's go to that. Here's what some of the Nuzi tablets look like. And some of these are about, yay big. If you ever go to Philadelphia, you should stop off at the University of Pennsylvania Archaeological Museum. They keep all of the clay tablets, I kid you not, in a room on the second floor behind chicken wire. You think, really? What's to prevent somebody from going in there? And they're literally like in mechanics drawers. You see in auto shops with the trays that come out. And what's to prevent somebody from breaking through the chicken wire barrier and just shoveling the things into a bag? And the answer is not a whole lot. It's just, museums are like this. We're going to talk about one piece tonight that was discovered in a museum. That kind of stuff happens. It's kind of odd, the way these things actually get stored and studied. But the Nuzi tablets are kind of an interesting example because at least two of them were used to explain Abram's fear that his servant Eliezer would become his heir. We know the biblical story. That's why he sends Eliezer out to find, a wife for Isaac. And there were some things about the biblical story, some of the patterns, some of the gestures, the expressions, the whole arranged marriage kind of thing, and in the Nuzi tablets. But the main difficulty, apart from the translational problems, is that the Nuzi tablets state that once adoption has been carried out, the adoptee could never be completely excluded from the inheritance, even if the son were born to his adopted parents. Now think about the biblical story. Abraham's all uptight because he says, look, I don't want this guy who isn't my son to inherit my estate. Okay, he has a son, but the son has no wife, there's no children. And so the Bible sort of presents it as an all or nothing proposition. And when the Nuzi tablets were discovered, this kind of situation actually shows up in some of the literature. But it's not a precise match because, again, there's this exception actually in the tablets. And when these were reported, most people tended to not report the disconnect. They reported the part that overlapped with the Old Testament, but not the part that didn't. And, people made a lot more of the tablets than probably what they should have. And archaeologists came along later and said, well, hey, this isn't really a good match. And so there were critics that said things like, this is what happens all the time. Those naughty evangelicals will take something out of the world of archaeology and say, we have a biblical match here, when really they don't. They have like a half match, and they don't tell you the other half. So it became kind of an issue of forthrightness or good methodology. But there, again, there's part of the story there that makes sense. There are certain things in the biblical narratives that, archaeologically speaking, have long been considered anachronisms. This is one of the big ones. If you really like camels, I can suggest some reading here. But camels were not supposed to be in the patriarchal era, according to archaeology. The mention of camels in the patriarchal narratives have long been viewed as anachronistic. For many years, they were thought to only have been domesticated in the Middle East in the first millennium BC, long after the patriarchs were dead and gone. And so certain archaeologists would look at the patriarchal stories and say, look at this. They're talking about a guy like Abraham who lives in 2000 BC, according to the biblical chronology. He's talking about camels. This is made up. It's not a historical detail because no camel bones have ever been found that go to that period. Well, not quite. Not quite true. There's other evidence that show very old texts. Look at the date. This is, again, part of the patriarchal era. There are Sumerian texts that mention camel's milk. I would suggest camel's milk, you need camels. You need to produce camel's milk. Another second millennium stone container with a picture or in a form of a camel. Jar at Mari, again, hindquarters of a camel on a jar, camel bones, again, in part of the Middle East, so on and so forth. So I want to bring up this example because it shows, again, from the other side, that the critics sometimes cheat as well. They can say, well, we don't have evidence of domesticated camels because of the animal bones that have been recovered from all these archaeological sites where the patriarchs were supposed to have been. Okay, maybe you don't, but what about this stuff? Okay, the same region of the world, why doesn't that count? And so you have a situation where archaeological material can get played with kind of fast and loose by both sides. And what I'm going to suggest to you is there's really no cure for that. Everybody's going to do it, everybody does it. And so you just have to spend a little time kind of sorting it out. So when you hear something either positive, like we have an exact match for this or that, be cautious. Be cautious in the way that you use that to talk to someone, again, maybe someone who's questioning their faith or wants to think about whether they can trust Scripture or not. Be careful in the way you use evidence. And when you hear something negative, always remember, well, there's going to be two sides to every story. Now, that is especially true. I'm going to skip the Philistines for sake of time. When we get to Israel and Egypt, how many of you have seen, this has been out for about a year, how many of you have seen the, I guess I don't know what to call it, it's not really a documentary, but the DVD called Patterns of Evidence video? Okay, I do recommend it. There's a lot of good things in there that I think if you're interested in this kind of subject matter, it would be good for you to see. I think they try to present all views of things. It's also good for showing what the real problems are, why the two sides, those who say that there was a Moses, the Exodus is a historical event, and those who say there was no such thing. So you got those two camps. And then in the believing camp, the ones who say that there was actually an Exodus, you further split them into two groups. Then they have two different dates for these events. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about, again, sort of the lay of the land, because that's really all we can do in an hour. As far as the bondage, if you, again, pick up a standard History of Israel textbook, written by just about any scholar, there are exceptions, but most scholars will say things like, well, There's really no evidence for Israel's presence in Egypt as slaves. There's no proof that they built anything. There's no proof for a significant Semitic population in Goshen, where the Bible has the Israelites. There's no proof of a Moses. There's no proof of a mass migration out. Basically, the whole thing. There's just nothing to hang your hat on. That depends on where you're looking. There is a standard accepted chronology in academia for when the Exodus events, the events that preceded the bondage in Egypt, and the events that came afterwards, the conquest of Canaan. There's a standard chronology that consensus academia uses to think about all of this stuff. If I asked you, who do you think most people say was the Pharaoh of the Exodus, who would you say? Ramses. You see it everywhere, even in Prince of Egypt, Disney cartoon, everywhere. Okay. I'm going to show you where that comes from, but if you assume that, then basically everything in the biblical account is vapor. There's no material evidence for any of it. If you don't assume it, if you say, well, if you start asking logical questions, Egypt and Ramses is the Pharaoh of the Exodus, and he's like, okay, that's like 1250 BC, and then they leave, and they wander around the desert for 40 years, and okay, that means the conquest is like 1200, and that's the late Bronze Age in biblical archaeology, and man, Jericho was unoccupied during that time, and it's all a vacuum. If you start asking logical questions like, well, hey, we excavated Jericho and people found lots of destruction, lots of signs of burning. When did that happen? Okay, if you ask logical questions like, well, is there anything in Egyptian literature, maybe not from the period where everybody thinks it should be, but is there anything that mentions like biblical plague language? Is there anything that talks about, well, there was a period in Egyptian history where the civilization completely collapsed because they had no army. They were overrun by foreigners. Is there anything like that? No, that's too late. You got to go the other direction. But what you have is, you have from Egyptian material, there are about 12 or so very clear, explicit connections with the biblical story, but none of them are in the time period that the consensus says this is when this happened. And since they're not in that time period, the consensus says the story is bogus. And then you have a small number of scholars that are like over on the other side waving their hands and saying, well, maybe we should give up the Ramses thing and look for something else. Let's at least try it, okay? Let's try that. Again, that's a minority voice in the community. So it all comes down to, again, when you decide what pegs you're going to use as far as your chronological reconstruction. And there is a reason why people pick Ramses. We'll get to that in a moment. But if you abandon that for a moment, I wanted to give you that up front because, throw Ramses out for a moment. You do have classes of involuntary servants mentioned in Egyptian texts that are Semites. You do have captive foreigners. It doesn't really apply to the Israelites in this case because they were there for a number of years. They weren't, wartime captives. There is evidence of Semitic laborers, again, a few hundred years before when the consensus says they should be there. There's no biblical reason to think that the Israelites built the pyramids or the big mortuary temples. The Bible never says that. You know what the Bible says? It says they were oppressed and they made bricks made out of straw. That's what it says. They built a couple storehouses in the Delta, but there's no mention of pyramids. There's no mention of big mortuary temples. There's nothing like that. But the consensus will say, well, this is part of the picture. And you say, well, no, it's really not. Oh, yeah, yes, it is. And since it is, then we don't find any evidence of that, then it can't be true. I mean, you will, have specific connections, but it may not show up in the time when, again, the majority view says it should be there. For instance, this mural shows both Egyptians and Semites making bricks out of straw. This is a wall painting in the tomb of someone named Beni Hassan. It dates to roughly late 1800s BC, which in the consensus view is far too early for the biblical story. So we can't count this. Doesn't count. Let's go through the basics of the chronology because we're going to wind up there and why there's this disconnect. People who adopt the consensus, again, the majority academic opinion, they don't really care. I hate to say it this way, but I'm just going to say it this way. They don't really care what the Bible says a lot of times. Again, that's probably a bit of an exaggeration with some, but with others, it's kind of on target. This verse here is a battleground verse. It says, in the 480th year, after the people of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, it's the Exodus, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over the house of Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, he began to build the house of the Lord. Again, it's reference to Solomon. Well, you do the math. You have to know when Solomon reigned. Everybody agrees with this date. Everybody under the sun, whether their view of the Bible is positive or negative, says, okay, we're pretty certain that Solomon came to the throne in 970 BC. And you get that date because you can synchronize certain things in Israelite history close to Solomon with other rulers from other lands. You just line up your synchronisms and then you fill in the numbers. And there you go. It also helps that the Assyrians and other Mesopotamian civilizations did lots of astronomy, and so you can actually correlate some of those materials with real-time astronomical events. So it's pretty secure. If you do the math, you count backwards, 4th year of Solomon's reign would be 966, 970 minus 4 is 966, and then you add 480 years back. Here's your date for the Exodus according to 1 Kings 6:1. It's just math, or so it would seem. Now, there are problems in the synchronism later on after Solomon, and that can affect a few things, but generally this is agreed on, and you just do the math, you fill in the numbers. Now that means, if you accept a literal chronological marker like this, that the Exodus occurred in something called the 18th dynasty in Egypt. This is part of the New Kingdom. The Moses and the Exodus story would overlap with the lives of Thutmose II, Hatshepsut, who was the female pharaoh, and Thutmose III. You'll notice these dates overlap because Thutmose III was the son of Hatshepsut, and it wasn't his decision to share the throne. It was Mom's decision to share the throne, and they didn't get along. And so she disappears, literally, from the record at a certain point. What happened to Mom? I don't know. She just didn't show up for work one day. And Thutmose III takes over. Now, look at the numbers here. This is what you're talking about as far as candidates for the Exodus, going by this date. The Pharaoh of the Exodus is never named in the Bible. Egyptian records don't name the biblical people related to this. So you're kind of like, okay, is there anything in the material record here that might help? There isn't a whole lot. This is Hatshepsut, obviously female appearance, but sometimes she wore the ceremonial beard. Yes, that's kind of weird, but they just did that. This is Thutmose III. He doesn't look so good over here. We don't have Hatshepsut's mummy. We do have Thutmose III. And Thutmose IV factors into this, who succeeded the third. Look at the dates here. Some scholars actually prefer Thutmose IV as the Pharaoh of the Exodus. They don't really care if the dates line up. For one reason, something called the dream stela of Thutmose IV, which basically says, here's what it looks like. Thutmose IV was not the firstborn son of his father. So he should not have become the next pharaoh, but he did. And the dream stela commemorates a dream that Thutmose said he had that said, the god appeared to him, the Sphinx deity, Horem Kethat, or Kefri Ra Atum, and tells him, hey, I know you're not the firstborn, but you're going to be king anyway. Well, the obvious connection is, people find this attractive because, well, what happened to Big Brother, who should have been Pharaoh? And well, he died, according to Egyptian records, but they don't really tell why. And so even though you have a disconnect chronologically, some people like that because it helps them explain the death of the firstborn, or at least account for it. I personally don't buy that because, again, just rabbit trailing here. If you go by Egyptian chronology, Thutmose IV would have been about 5 years old when he supposedly had this dream and wrote it down, so it's a little shady. It's probably propaganda after the fact to still explain why he gets to be pharaoh, but still. Here are the basics of what we're dealing with. Again, if you take 1 Kings 6:1 seriously, here's Solomon, 4th year. Do the math, you got 1446, it's 480 years. The conquest would begin around 1406, and the verse references here are to things like the 40 years wandering and whatnot. When Moses, how many years Moses spent in Egypt, how old he was, when he gets to Midian and returns back to Egypt. So again, you just plug in the numbers. Moses was 80. By the time the Exodus occurs, so you add 80, you're back here to 1525 BC for Moses' birth. And again, filling in some of the chronological information here for Jacob in Egypt, he winds up at about 1876 BC. Now, I just showed you a picture of Semites making bricks with straw that dates into the 1800s. It's a good example because on one hand, I can say, well, here we have the bondage, proof of the bondage. But if you actually do the numbers, that's when Jacob goes into Egypt. It's actually too early because he doesn't go down to Egypt a slave, does he? Well, it doesn't take too long before things get bad, but it's still not quite what you'd want as far as asynchronism, but it's barely close. This is what's known as the early chronology. The early chronology is 1446 BC. It is the minority view because it's based on the biblical numbers, the literal biblical numbers. The late chronology is about 200 years that way, 1250 we'll call it. And that's the consensus view. And so if you have the Exodus in the 1200s, nothing else in the biblical account works. That's why archaeologists say it's got to be a myth. Nothing else lines up here. If you have it back here, then some things do start to line up. Now the question that should be popping into your head is, well, why is everybody just such a stickler for not accepting this date and moving it 200 years ahead? And the answer is, well, that's when Ramses lived. We've got to have Ramses as the pharaoh of the Exodus. Because we like Ramses. It's not as superficial as that. There are actually other reasons for it. Again, this is just a sketch of the chronology. Even the biblical literal date has problems. Were there really 480 years between Solomon and the Exodus? If you take the biblical numbers for the wandering, the years of the judges, you just add up all the numbers in the book. 91 years of judgeships from Jephthah to Samuel. Okay, you have until Jephthah, after Jephthah. We don't really know how long Saul reigned. There's a problem in some of the passages there. We do have 80 years given for the reigns of Saul and David. You do the math and you come out with 510. So the numbers don't agree. So even, again, for the sort of biblical literalist view, you have a disconnect. The way this is usually resolved is to posit, we don't know for sure, you can build a decent case for it, to posit the idea that some of the judgeships overlapped. And we don't have to take the numbers consecutively, but some of them overlap with each other. They lived at the same time. Very possible. Won't get into why. This is a big deal in the subject. You may have seen this term if you've ever done any study on this. Again, if you're in the consensus view, you have an Exodus around 1250 BC. The people of Israel would have been there for, they've been slaves for how long? 400 and some years. So you're 1650 pushing back in close to 1700, but you're right smack dab in the middle of this period, which happens to be something called the Hyksos period. And scholars are like, oh, this is perfect. This is perfect. Ramses, Pharaoh, and then that puts the Semites, Joseph and Jacob and his family, back in Egypt during the Hyksos period. You say, what's the big deal? The Hyksos were Semitic. They were Semites. Their name means rulers of foreign lands, not shepherd kings. Some older archaeological sources will have shepherd kings, and that's not actually a good translation. I think it actually comes from part of the name. This in Egyptian, this is Heka Kasut, which literally means rulers of foreign lands. If you want to get into hieroglyphs, this is the determinative for hilly place. Okay? So it refers to a land, not an occupation. But if you look at the first letter here, it looks like a shepherd's crook, and so people thought, oh, shepherds, the biblical guys, and all that kind of stuff. And so, these assumptions were made. And since it fit with the Ramses date, people thought, 2 thumbs up. We got it here. Got it. But what they didn't tell you is that, well, if we accept this is the Joseph period and an Exodus under Ramses, nothing else in the biblical account works. That's the part they're not telling you. I mean, they'll tell you that now because we have this I think, you all know that kind of militant atheism is sort of the thing now. And I think it's fair to say that militant skepticism about Scripture, about things like this, is sort of in vogue too. I mean, it's always been, present in the academy, but they're more predisposed now to kind of pressing the point just so that they can say nothing else works. So it's a myth, but here's the best fit for it. And if you do that, if you go with the evidence, then the biblical story is a myth. And they're cheating, but they're not going to tell you that. The Hyksos were eventually expelled by the Egyptians, and people would naturally say, oh, wow, maybe this is what really happened, and that's where the Exodus story was kind of made up. And you say, well, wait a minute, the Exodus story, they weren't expelled. They left voluntarily. No. Some biblical guy got it messed up. Okay, you see where we're going here. We're taking circumstantial connections and we're rewriting the narrative. And this is what's done commonly, again, in consensus thinking. And here's another one from Beni Hassan tomb painting showing a band of Asiatic nomads. Asiatic is the Egyptian word for Semite. So we very clearly right here, look, there it is. Heka Kasut, which again in Egyptian means rulers of foreign lands, but people saw that and the crook and, oh, we got animals here, must be shepherds. That was just the assumption. That's just the way it was articulated. Is Joseph really to be associated with the Hyksos? If you take the biblical view, you can't say yes to that question because the chronology doesn't fit. But you say, no, wait a minute. Joseph was a Semite, and here we have a period where you had Semites as pharaohs. And Semites occupied high offices in Egypt. Didn't Joseph occupy a high office in Egypt? Well, sure. Sure he did. But there are other things going on here. Let me just go back here. Do you remember the Joseph story? When Joseph gets pulled out of prison and he has to go, Pharaoh wants to talk to him. What does he do before he goes to see Pharaoh? Anybody remember? He takes a bath and he shaves himself. Why? Because it was offensive to Egyptians to have facial hair across the board. If you're a Semite as a Pharaoh, you're not really going to care. Because that's what we do. So there's some significant disconnections with the story that, again, if Joseph is a Semite, Pharaoh's a Semite, it's like, hey, we're all Semites here. One big happy family. You don't need to shave because we're cool with that. But that is not the way the story reads. And there are other things. I'm just picking out a few problems here. Again, if you're taking the biblical chronology at face value, Jacob went to Egypt when he was 130. He dies 17 years later. Again, the date for this was 1876 BC, if you remember the little chart. He dies 17 years later. Presumably, Joseph dies a little later than that. Again, there's some biblical numbers here. Basically, you have Jacob and Joseph, according to the Bible's chronology, dying before the Hyksos period. So if you take the biblical numbers at face value, you cannot agree with the dominant view. What I'm doing here, again, I realize that this is kind of scattershot and going through pretty fast, but there are very clearly two opposing views here. Okay, there's the consensus view, and then there's one that really tries hard to align itself with the biblical data. And this is where the fight is. You will find evangelicals on the other side, though, because of the Ramses connection. We'll get to that pretty soon here. Another element that doesn't work with the Joseph story. Joseph gets a new wife. Pharaoh says, hey, you did a good job here. You want to get married? And Joseph's like, well, it beats prison. Sure, why not? Even though she's a Gentile, nobody complains, okay? He gives her the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. On was the center of solar worship in ancient Egypt. The only problem is the Hyksos didn't worship the solar deity. So again, if it's a Hyksos pharaoh, the biblical story just doesn't make much sense. But that doesn't deter people who want Joseph in that period, because that's where you need to have him to have Ramses be the pharaoh of the Exodus. You just have to do that. Oh, let's see here. As far as names, who takes the early date? Again, putting emphasis on the biblical numbers. Probably the two most prominent names here, and they're both retired now. Bryant Wood, who still occasionally does some lecturing. I know both these guys, and Bryant still travels, to conferences. I saw him last year, but he also had a bout with cancer, so he doesn't do too much actively anymore. Chuck Ailing just retired from Northwestern in St. Paul. But they're probably the two most prominent writers who had teaching positions and actually did archaeology. Wood's PhD is in ceramics. Isn't that awesome? Like, sign me up for that. I get to study pottery and write a dissertation on pottery. No, thank you. But he loves it. And he's done a lot of good publications. But beyond these two guys, again, you don't have anybody that's sort of, kind of a name in the field. On the other side, let's see here. Oh, no, wait. Yeah, do I want to do that? So if you hold, again, just to summarize, if you hold to an early date, again, 1446, you can't have Joseph in the Hyksos, and you can't have Ramses as the pharaoh of the Exodus. Now, as a bonus, believe it or not, Josephus has the Israelites leaving Egypt under Moses with the Hyksos. You say, oh, drat. Why did Josephus have to go and say that? Well, the short answer is Josephus is getting it from somebody who lives during his own time period. Sources, again, that are 1,000 years removed from the actual incident. And he's making them part of his history. You realize Josephus is not infallible. I hope you realize that. I mean, he does make mistakes. And sometimes I'm on his side when the world is against him. Other times I'm like, boy, dude, you had a bad day when you wrote that. But nevertheless, he has it. That's what he says. Now, as a real outlier, let's do a little bit of what I call paleobabble, which is a nice word for nonsense. You will run into this on the internet, which is why I threw it in. Question. Take a good look at this guy. Front view, side view. How would you describe him ethnically?
Abe Lincoln-esque.
Yeah.
I knew somebody would say that, but that's not what I'm looking for. You go stand in the corner. What are his facial features?
Big nose.
Big nose. You know, I hate to be so racist isn't the right word, but okay, let's go with the big nose.
Big nose.
When you get a guy with a big nose, you chances are might think of which ethnic group?
Israelites.
Right, Jews, okay. All right, so that's fair. And people look at this and go, huh, guy kind of looks Semitic. And you can barely tell it here, he has facial hair. The mummy actually has facial hair. Not typical of an Egyptian. That's him on the left, his wife on the right. Pretty well preserved, actually. She does. She does. That is the mummy of Yuya. And there is one guy on the internet that insists that this is Joseph. He thinks he looks Jewish. The odd position of the hands, this is the only mummy like this, instead of something like that, or arms just kind of, either missing or... It's an odd pose, facial hair, again, kind of those Semitic features. He is also called in his tomb a father of Pharaoh. Is in Genesis 45:8 of Joseph. To me, that's the only point real here worth considering. The problem is that the remains were found in Egypt, in an Egyptian tomb, and so, what about all these references to removing the bones of Joseph? Okay, Moses did that. Joseph asked for it. And there's also a chronological disconnect. This Yuya doesn't actually come from any of the periods that really fall into either of the views we've been talking about. But that hasn't stopped Ahmed Osman, who's a journalist. He's not an Egyptologist or scholar or anything like that. He's written a couple books about it, and you will see it on the internet a lot. Nobody is buying it. If you're interested in this, I'll send you a review by a guy named Donald Redford, who is an Egyptologist, and I have only one word for this review: brutal. It's very rare when you see someone's work mocked publicly in a journal. This is one of those times. Because Osman has to make all sorts of arguments that not only violate the biblical account, but violate lots of other stuff in Egyptian records too. But he insists that this has to be really because of this title. Now there are similar titles, a father of the god, okay, that you will find in tombs, said of individuals who were high court officials. You say, well, is that a match for a father of Pharaoh? Doesn't sound like it, a father of God. Well, don't forget, to the Egyptians, Pharaoh was the state deity. Okay? So it's not quite as good of a case as you'd think, and there are about 10 other things, really significant things against it. But I thought I'd bring it up because you see it a lot. Why all the focus on Ramses? This is Ramses II, Ramses the Great. Again, the Pharaoh of the Exodus is not actually named, but this is the consensus candidate. It's really because of Exodus 1:11. You can flip there if you want. Anybody know what Exodus 1:11 says? The Israelites built the storehouses of Pithom and Ramses.
I thought the name was mentioned.
Ramses is mentioned several times, but never Pharaoh Ramses. The first time you get in the biblical record of Pharaoh named, I believe, is Necho, which is in the divided kingdom many years later. Which, interestingly enough, is also an Egyptian pattern of naming pharaohs and whatnot. Don't want to get too rabbit trail on that. Exodus 1:11 has the Israelites building 2 store cities. One of them has the name Ramses on it. And Exodus 12 mentions that again. Exodus 12 is leading up. That's the account of the Passover. Part of the plagues, the Passover. Exodus 14 is the crossing of the Reed Sea, the Yam Suf in Hebrew, the Sea of Reeds. It's not actually Red Sea. We'll say something about that in a moment. And then Exodus 15 is the Song of Moses celebrating the deliverance through the sea. So this is part of the Exodus account, both of these passages here, and they mention Ramses. So people look at this and say, look, end of debate. End of debate. This has to be the time of Ramses. Because why else would they call the storehouse, the store cities, the city of Ramses? Why would you do that? I have here. What about Genesis 47:11? Somebody look that up, please.
It says in the land of Ramses.
Okay, go ahead and read it.
Then Joseph settled his father and his brothers and gave them possession of the land of Egypt in the best of the land of Ramses, as Pharaoh had commanded. Is that what you want?
And who was that about? Well, now wait a minute. Joseph lived hundreds of years before Ramses. And there are no other Pharaoh Ramseses, pardon the butchery of the English language there. There are no other Pharaoh Ramseses around that time.
Does Ramses mean something else?
Or is it common?
It's not common. It's common in the New Kingdom, the 19th dynasty. Everybody gets to be named Ramses because everybody's related to everybody else. I throw that in there because, on the one hand, since these two references are set in the Exodus story, and people see the word Ramses, the name, they think, end of story. They'll use the name as a chronological indicator, a chronological linchpin, but that doesn't work in Genesis 47. So you ask, well, how else could you look at this? Another shot of Ramses. He can stand to gain a few pounds. Okay. Now, again, Ramses is the only pharaoh to reign 40 plus years. Only other one. The other one's Tutmos III. And again, this is the consensus date, and all this other stuff, this biblical literalism, is impossible. But what about, if I stuck this in here, yeah. What about Ramses? If you believe in an Exodus before Ramses, and you look at Genesis 47 and say, well, look, you got a reference to Ramses before Ramses is ever supposed to be here anyway in the Bible. So how can you use the name to be able to say, well, okay, explain that. How can you have the name before the guy lived? This is how you do it. You do it by saying that someone updated place names in the Torah. In other words, somebody, think about it. Let's say you're Moses, you write the Pentateuch, or at least part of it, and you're writing an account of the people, their history, and let's just call it 1400 BC is when you produce the Torah. 400 years later, 200 years later, maybe even only 100 years later. So the people living 100 years later, they're reading along in what Moses wrote, and they go, what is this place? I don't recognize this name. And so an editor would come along and say, okay, now it's called Ramses, but before it was called something else. And the reader goes, oh, okay, I get it. I know where we're at now on the map. You say, well, that sounds like cheating, except for the fact that there's actually evidence in the Bible of doing this. Genesis 14:14, Deuteronomy 34:1 specifically mention Dan. Okay, Dan. If you look up named Dan during the time of the judges, because that's what this verse says. It says prior to that time it was called Laish. Let's go look up the verse, that's what it says. It's not very exciting, but it's important here. What that means is In the time of the judges, if the name was changed in the time of the judges, that's after Moses lived. So how can we find Dan in Moses' writings? The answer is somebody changed the name so that you would know. And they tell you right here what it used to be. This does happen. There are maybe 6, 7 examples of this in the Old Testament where someone has changed a place name so that the readers of his day would know where in the world you're talking about this or that event happening. So people who want to take an earlier view of the Exodus will say, look, this is what obviously has to be going on with Ramses, because you have a reference to it in Genesis 47 in the time of Joseph, when it just shouldn't be there. Somebody, again, when people would know who Ramses was, put it there later, and earlier it was something else. Probably, if you're going with archaeological material, it was probably Avaris. It would have been the name of the place. So the name Ramses, what this comes down to, is that just because we get Ramses in Exodus 1:11 doesn't mean we have to have Ramses as the Pharaoh of the Exodus. But yet everyone goes there. Everyone says that has to be what happened. That has to be the connection. And if you make that connection, nothing else in the biblical story works. If you don't make the connection, then there are things in the Egyptian record that can correlate with the biblical material and correlate kind of dramatically in some cases. But nobody today, I shouldn't say nobody, but most scholars today don't even want to hear that because they are married to the Ramses view. That's just the reality of it. Merentah gets talked about in this, maybe a candidate for the Exodus. Not many people would say this, but some people do. Here's the Merentah stela. Merentah is a pharaoh that follows Ramses in that dynasty. And this stela is famous for being what, at least until recent years, was thought to be the only reference to Israel in an Egyptian monument. Merentah, if you use the chronology for the pharaohs, would have lived in 1206 BC. And that's kind of like late date territory. So this drew a lot of attention. The text says, Israel is laid waste, its or his seed is no more. So Merentah basically is, talking about, lots of other people groups and countries and cities in this stela, basically that, hey, I beat them all, or they're nothing, and they're toast, and all this kind of stuff. And Israel is in this list, which is kind of curious, because if you have an Exodus, say 1250, like 50 years later, then Israel's like hardly existing at all. Does that make any sense? No. That would have been the time of the conquest. So Merentah doesn't fit, but again, the consensus view will just say, oh, it's just biblical embellishment. Don't worry about that. Here's the spelling for Israel in the Merentah stela. This is Y-S-R-Y. The falcon here is the ah sound. And then the mouth here, this is it's supposed to be a mouth. Pardon the Egyptian artists here. That can be either an R or an L. So this is your place name here. Now, here's the interesting part. You have the man and the woman here at the end, and the little dashes are to denote plurality. So lots of them, okay? This is not what you would see as a determinative. In hieroglyphs, determinatives are signs that classify words. They're like glorified cheat glyphs. Like, I can't remember, what category of word this fits in. Well, thank you, Mr. Scribe. You tell me where to place it because you added a determinative at the end, so I know it goes in this bucket. This is what you get with people groups and not really lands. But you know what? If the Exodus was 1250 and they wandered for 40 years, They're actually in a land, aren't they, by the time Maranatha is Pharaoh? They're in the land of Canaan. They have a land, don't they? So why doesn't the Maranatha stela reflect that? And the answer to some people is because the chronology is wrong. Because the Pharaoh of the Exodus was not Ramses. Because you're 200 years too far ahead. But the consensus view would say, oh, well, maybe the scribe was kind of sloppy here. It's imprecise. It still kind of counts as a place, even though it doesn't have the right hieroglyphs there. We'll still go with it. Thanks. Now, this is a quote from James Pritchard, who was not an evangelical. He's been deceased for quite a bit. Much has been made of the fact that the word Israel is the only one of the names in the context which is written with the determinative people rather than a land. Thus, we should seem to have the children of Israel in or near Palestine, but not yet as a settled people. This would have an important bearing on the day of the conquest. This is a valid argument. So Pritchard is basically saying, yeah, this is kind of odd that the Egyptians would have chosen this way to write the term. Determinative should have meaning, and a contrast between determinatives in the same context should be significant. All of the other places, okay, the stela does give the country determinative, the land sign, to settled peoples that are in the list, the Rebu, the Temeh, the Hatti, Ashkelon, etc. Gives the determinative people to unlocated groups. Here's the list. Israel would not be an unlocated group is the point if this was actually after the Exodus, 50 years after the Exodus. They are in the land. So people have noticed this, but again, basically not cared too much about it. Now, I said that the Maranatha stela was, up until recently, considered the only Egyptian monument that had the name Israel in it. There are a number of people who are changing their view right now. This is the object that was found in a museum. Okay. This is called the Berlin pedestal, Berlin stele, Berlin statue, 21687 if you want to be precise. These are, you'll notice, we have a person here, and it's hard to see here, but you see the little bow tie thing here? Those are bound captives. Okay, that's the way they're depicted in hieroglyphs. Bound captive, and presumably bound captive. We've lost the edge here. Now, the interesting thing about this isn't this one, it's this one, the one that has half of it missing. Because if you look at the consonants that you can make out here, there's the reed for the Y. This is sort of what would I call it, a bottle cap with prongs. Egyptians did not have bottle caps. Okay. That's the sh sound. This is considered to be the beak of a bird. That would be the ah sound, just like the other one. And then an R down here. It's starting to look like kind of some of the same hieroglyphs in the name Israel, doesn't it? Well, there are some people who think that's exactly what we have. And here's the reconstruction. Except it's a different spelling. This would be Ya-Sha-Yir. But, fortunately, or unfortunately, like other languages, hieroglyphic signs can sometimes be more than one letter. The sh, sha, the r here, right here, could also be an L. So you could have either this, Ya-Sha-Yir, or Yasrael, Israel. Could be one or the other. This term right here shows up in no other Egyptian text known to mankind, which has led a number of people to say, this is probably better because it's in a list of places, and these other two places are in Canaan. Okay, they're right next door, Syria, Palestine. So whoever made this object is again boasting of the places they've conquered, because these are conquered foreigners. They're tied up, their hands are tied. So here we have a pharaoh who's boasting about this. Now, if you take the whole thing, guess when this falls into the chronology? You guessed it, the early date. Okay, 200 years before Ramses. That's why people are now fighting over this. It can't be Israel. It can't be. Again, and you probably won't hear about this in, again, popular discussion. You will hear about it if you read journal articles, if you're a geek, okay? This is what happens. Okay, this is the cost of geekdom here. You run into stuff like this. And it's, there it is. So it would be, this is actually a good example of the kind of thing that if you don't presume the Ramses connection, which situates the Exodus in a certain period of time, if you're willing to move it back 200 years, you get stuff like this that make that view plausible. Whereas the consensus view, you got a vacuum. Let's talk about the root of the Exodus a little bit. Time check, please.
10:32.
Okay, I'll do this in a few minutes. Yeah, I knew I would get through this in an hour. Root of the Exodus. Oh, yes. This is one of my favorite things to just drive myself insane with. This is the traditional root. Okay, you've all seen this in study Bibles. Here we are up in Goshen in the Delta. We journey out a little bit. Here's Pithom, Pithom and Ramses. Okay, Tel El Daba is now the site, the archaeological site of Ramses right here. So here's where we originate. And we go down here, and we straddle the left arm of the Red Sea, and we cross something somewhere. We go down here to Sinai. This is the traditional location of Sinai. And then we go up here, and we eventually find our way into the land. There are actually other options, other routes. Now, the one we know that they didn't take is the way of the sea, the way of the Philistines here, because the account says specifically don't go that route. So that one can be ruled out, but there's a caravan path right here. There's one that crosses here, and of course the traditional route. So you have a number of possibilities to actually cross. You say, well, how do we know? What does it matter? If we go back here, there are actually, there's more than three, but we'll go with three. There are actually three sort of candidates for Sinai. Do you realize the only real reason we have this as Mount Sinai is because of Constantine's mom? Constantine's mom, she was a believer, so we can't poke fun at her too much. But she fancied herself as an archaeologist. That happened there. It was like, hey, you're the emperor's mom, we're not going to argue. It would be bad for us. And this is the traditional spot. Over here is another mountain called Jebel al-Lawz that some people think is Sinai, and I actually kind of favor this one. Up here there's something called Har Karkom, which to some is a candidate. And it depends on which route you think they took. That's part of it. Now look at this. We have Exodus 13. I want to show you why this is tough. God led the people around by the way of the wilderness toward the Red Sea. Hebrew, it's Yam Suf, the Sea of Reeds. And the people of Israel went up out of the land of Egypt equipped for battle. So here we are, Pithom, Ramses, Sukkot is mentioned in the narratives, and so they take off here. They probably, again, start on this route, but then some parts of the narrative have them turning. You don't really know which way they turn. So, like, did they turn and go here? Did they turn and go all the way down? We're not really sure. But anyway, they start out toward the Red Sea. Well, it's not really the Red Sea as we think of it. It's the Sea of Reeds. That's what the Hebrew text says. This term is applied to the Red Sea occasionally, but only on this prong in the Bible, anyway. Exodus 14. Then the Lord said to Moses, tell the people of Israel to turn back and encamp in front of Pi-Hahirot, between Migdol and the sea, in front of Baal-Zephon. You shall encamp facing it by the sea. For Pharaoh will say to the people of Israel, they're wandering in the land, the wilderness has shut them in. Exodus 14 never uses the phrase Yam Suf, Red Sea. It just says the sea. Well, that's nice. How many bodies of water do we have here? On this map, we have two. If you actually look at Google Earth, you got more than that. So it's really hard to know what in the world they crossed. Exodus 15. Pharaoh's chariots and his host he cast into the sea. And his chosen officers were sunk in the Red Sea. Now here we got both of them. So in chapter 13, we got one phrase. Chapter 14, we got another, and not the first one. And now we got both of them. Let me make it worse for you. Okay? Numbers 33. Let me make it worse. I'm good at that. So the people of Israel set out from Ramses and camped at Succoth. And they set out from Succoth and camped at Etham, which is on the edge of the wilderness. And they set out from Etham and turned back to Pi-Hahirot, which is east of Baal-Zephon. They camped before Migdal. Sounds really close to Exodus 13, right? Same place names, here we go. And they set out from before Hahirot, and catch this, they passed through the midst of the sea into the wilderness, and they went 3 days' journey in the wilderness of Etham and camped at Marah. And from Marah, they went to Elim, and eventually they wind up with the Red Sea. Well, wait a minute. Wait a minute, I thought they were supposed to cross this, but they cross the sea, they go through the midst of the sea before they ever get to the other one. What in the world is going on? They went through the sea before they hit the Red Sea. Well, wait a minute, Exodus 15 said it was the Red Sea. Like what? You just throw up your hands. It's like, what in the world is going on? Now, a lot of it, at least today, I'll just give you little snippets here. Pi-Hahirot shows up. Notice there's a question mark here. In Egyptian, Pi-Hahirot means the mouth of the canal. Okay, the mouth of the canal. So it has been transliterated into Hebrew, and some people think, okay, this is a clue. Can we find an ancient canal anywhere? Maybe that would help. Well, in this map, someone proposed that there was a canal here, and I'm wondering if I took, oh, this is in Google Earth in this case. But if you look at the dotted lines here, this is all canal. At one time in antiquity, all of these bodies, the Bala Lakes, this, Lake Timsah, the Bitter Lakes, and down here is the left prong of the Red Sea, they were all connected by a canal. So, what did they cross? Did they cross the canal? Did they cross one of these? We don't really know, but this helps explain why, to an ancient person, you could have used any of these terms and been talking roughly about the same thing. Okay? Because they were all connected at one time. That is a satellite photograph here. I want to show you a few other things about the crossing. Now, most people think that they crossed up here somewhere, because here you can see a little bit of the connectivity right here, and then they wander down or wander over to Sinai. There are other locations that some people have argued for. See down here how it's really narrow down here? Some people believe that they crossed, the canal, that wasn't the crossing of the sea, and they went down here and they crossed here. Why do they believe that? Because this is what it looks like. This is Google Earth. This is a screenshot I took yesterday. There is a natural land bridge at this point. And so some people look at the Exodus account about God using a wind to blow away the waters and all that sort of thing, and they think, well, maybe they crossed here. That would put Sinai over here in Midian. Remember I said that was one of the possible locations? Why is Sinai and Midian? Why would that make sense? I'm playing my hand here. I favor Sinai and Midian, but there's one reason why. Remember the burning bush episode? Moses is out tending the flocks where? Midian. Okay. It doesn't make any sense for Moses to drive sheep or goats 300 or 400 miles to get something to eat. Okay, it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Not only that, but Paul refers to Sinai in Arabia. And Arabia is a notoriously elastic term in ancient texts. Yeah, you can find some Roman period texts that call this Arabia, but you can find them over here too. And of course, that's what we would think of as Arabia anyway, in modern times. So some people think the crossing was down there. Others say no, it was like in the middle of the Gulf of Aqaba. I mention this because you will see this on the internet as well a lot. Here's the alternate route. Here's this presumed crossing to get to Mount Sinai and Midian, if that is indeed where it is. Here's Jebel al-Lawz. Jebel al-Lawz was a volcanic mountain. It is burned on the top. Again, that's why some people like it as a candidate for Sinai. Now, I'm showing you this picture because I want to discourage you. Okay, so I'm hoping I'm not saying anything too offensive here, but the champion of this crossing, not the Jebel al-Lawz stuff, that comes from a number of other sources, but the champion of this stuff, oh, there's a pillar here, Solomon's pillar, that we supposedly found, and the Saudis took it away, and now you can't see it anymore. And there was another pillar over here that supposedly, like has Paleo-Hebrew writing that talks about the Exodus and all this kind of stuff. This is the view of Ron Wyatt, who is famous/infamous in biblical archaeological circles as far as, kind of like your layman's archaeology. I don't really take anything for what I don't really buy anything Ron Wyatt says. This was the guy who said, I've discovered the Ark of the Covenant, and the blood of Jesus seeped down through the Temple Mount and dripped on the Ark. And, just basically Ron has discovered everything, okay? And can't show you any of it. Because it's like the giants in the Smithsonian. Someone stole it, and there's a big conspiracy. Okay, so I'm just telling you right now, you might go looking for this and find Ron Wyatt and think, oh, does Mike like Ron Wyatt stuff? Does he think it's credible? No, I don't. But I do, again, I have reasons of my own here for liking this view. But that's what you get. So what did we learn tonight? We learned that you can get a headache really fast when you start thinking about this stuff. And I'm half serious there, but what I really want you to take away is, look, when you see, especially again online, on the internet, maybe I'm a little too sensitive to this because I do lots of stuff online, I get lots of email from people, and maybe I'm just gun shy or just, I don't know. But when you see stuff online or at the impulse shelf in the grocery store, okay, usually around Passover time. See, the Passover time, that's when they hit the Exodus and have to destroy that. And then around Christmas time is when you'll get the Jesus stuff at the impulse shelf in the grocery store about how Jesus was just a man, or he was just like some wacko or zealot or whatever he was. Okay, don't be troubled. Let not your heart be troubled. There are always two sides to every debate. What you get in popular sources, like the internet, like the History Channel, like the impulse shelf in the grocery store, is filtered to you. It just is. And we can speculate and wax conspiratorial and kind of silly about why that is, but that is the way it is. To really get at the material and try to get the lay of the land for everything, and all the different possibilities, and just kind of think about it, you have to get into more serious material. That's just the nature of the beast. So let not your heart be troubled by some of these things. On the other side, good luck. It's difficult. It's difficult, but I think you can create a pretty good circumstantial case for the historicity of these things. Not in every detail, but there are connections if you go the other way. And I lean toward the early date side of things. I'm not troubled by saying things like, well, maybe biblical numbers shouldn't be taken at face value. That doesn't bother me, because there's a certain artificiality to some of that. Why does everything happen in 40s? Have you ever wondered? Why is every king like 40? Everything's 40, 40, 40, 40, 40. Is that just a coincidence, or maybe there's something going on there? Maybe it's a literary device or something like that. I don't have any trouble with that. The reason I gravitate toward that other view is because you get some really interesting synchronisms if you do that. And I think we ought to be willing to consider that possibility rather than just dismiss it. So I feel kind of stupid asking for questions since I'm over time, but I'll do it anyway. Okay, any questions? Any gasps of despair? many white flags.
This might be a silly
Sure.
thing, but I think it was in National Geographic, you know. But didn't they find some of the chariots at the bottom of Red Sea or somewhere in that crossing? That they said are shields or something?
The last slide here. I hate to crush your spirit here.
No, I thought it was.
I've seen that video.
Yeah.
No, I've seen it too. It's one of Ron Wyatt's, claims.
Okay, I wondered.
If you go to the last slide there are 2 links, and I don't know if they're live in the PDF or not. If they're not, I can just send you the links if you email me. But it's another one of these cases where no one's ever actually found one of the objects that was supposedly discovered. And if there, again, I don't want to be too accusatory here. Either Wyatt or somebody working for Wyatt sort of misrepresented somebody's work on, believe it or not, somebody actually wrote a book on this, Egyptian chariot wheels. And what he says he has really wouldn't conform to the Exodus story anyway.
See, I was excited when I saw that.
Yeah, I mean, to me it's one of those things when I see that come up on the internet, I try not to just say, oh, here we go again. But it's like, well, hey, maybe we got something here. That would be kind of neat. And you give it some time, and eventually, it either comes out either indeterminate, maybe, it'll go from a maybe to a maybe, a serious maybe, or you'll find out that there's just nothing to this. And consistently, Wyatt has been in the other bucket, unfortunately. Again, I'm not doubting his testimony or anything like that, but it's not a good tactical thing to be really methodologically poor, even to the point of kind of being a little kind of cheating, because eventually somebody's going to produce something to the contrary, and then people will look at that and say either, well, that's what Christians do, or they're so desperate they have to cheat. It never has a good outcome. It just doesn't. Saying you don't know or you're not sure is okay. But I can give it to the other side. Withholding information is also not okay. There is another possibility here, even though it goes against the consensus, that really deserves a good look. It really does. Anybody else? Thank you for coming again.